My topic, as you see, is very broadly defined. I come to it as someone who began in the pro-life movement, representing all of the U.S. bishops, and came through conversations with post-aborted women to understand that I had to approach the family as a scholar in order to understand the abortion issue. And then, in the context of the United States, and more also in the international arena, I came to have to confront restrictions on religious freedom that were impeding the movements for life and family. And so thus my topic. What I am taking up today, you could say, is broadly two things. One, the question of sexualityism, which I will define for you, versus feminism, and then sexualityism as a force against religious freedom. So I'm going to start by talking about the rise of this phenomenon I call sexualityism, its sources, and then its clash with religious freedom and how we struggle with this. Now we live at a time, speaking first about the rise of sexualityism, when the powerlessness of the state to provide personal and social security is more and more evident. We're also at a time when we see that a great deal of data shows that people without family lack the insurance, the margins to cope with external forces that pressure them financially or personally. We also are at a time where, as Professor Carlson pointed forward, emerging research continually reaffirms the superiority of the natural family for providing individual and social security. Despite this, familism, understood as a social pattern in which the family assumes the position of ascendancy. It is the model through which we understand our personal and social good is on the decline. Now, obviously, this decline is irrational, but because it goes against all the personal and the empirical data. I'm going to look at the evidence as to its being in decline, and then I'm going to ask what is replacing it, which I will call sexualityism, and ask why sexualityism is replacing it. Finally, I'll consider the clash between this emerging ideology of sexualityism and religious freedom. What's the evidence that familism is in decline? Well, in addition to the absence of policies in not only in the United States, but one sees also in South America, in Europe, at the United Nations, policies which would secure and promote marriage, slow divorce, encourage marital stability, avoid non-marital births. And probably in your countries as in mine, one talks about avoiding teenage non-marital births, but there's no discussion of avoiding non-marital births among the largest cohorts, the 20 and 30-year-olds. In the United States, 83% of our non-marital births are women 20 and older. We also have, as evidence of the decline of familism, constant references in the academic and the legal sources, cases and laws, to the fluidity, the changeability, the diversity of the family. We also have constant suggestions in the legal academic literature that the diversity of family form is a good for its own sake, or that if society recognizes it, it will be a precursor to state money flowing to these diverse families other than the natural family and supporting them. Or that diversity of family form is good because it allows women to avoid patriarchal family forms. Also, every time there is a call to the return of the natural family, we are reminded by interest groups that this will certainly mean the return of problematic phenomena such as patriarchy, limited roles for women, couples feeling trapped in bad marriages, or bad social opinions of children and women living in alternative family forms. In addition to ideology, which I call after someone I will discuss from Harvard who invented the term sexualityism. Now, proponents of this ideology never use the term. They rather dwell on the language of equality, non-discrimination, human rights. But if you look behind those labels, you will see not the classic understanding of those terms, right? The call to treat all persons equally with their God-given dignity, but rather new claims about these contents of non-discrimination, equality, or human rights. New claims which I call sexualityism. Now, what is the meaning of this term? It was first used by a development economist named Lant Pritchett. He was active in the Cairo and Beijing conferences at the time, an economist with the World Bank. He's now a development economist at Harvard University. His commentary traces the changing of the arguments that the U.S. and other wealthy Western nations were using to support massive contraception as the bulk of their foreign aid policies. First, they claimed that it would respond to poverty, right, by responding to a population bomb. But then there was a massive deceleration in the 1980s of population, along with widely differential impacts between countries of these contraceptive programs. In some countries, their gross domestic product went up as their population increased. And so we had to back off the population theory that more population was poverty to a more nuanced theory that while population was related to poverty, it wasn't the primary phenomenon. Further studies began to show that the levels of contraceptive inputs and the price of contraception and the ease of its availability were not driving fertility. And it was also well known that prior to the advent of large contraceptive programs in some countries over time, people were already controlling their fertility in response to external circumstances. So why, asks Professor Pritchett, at the 1990s Cairo and Beijing UN conferences was the major emphasis on contraception? Why was this the focus? He answers an ideology called sexualityism, which is that the expression of human sexuality in any way that the person feels inclined to express it is in and of itself a positive good, and any limitations on that expression is in and of itself a bad thing. Another way of putting this, that sexual intimacy is not at all linked to what it appears naturally obvious that it is linked to: strengthening of the bond between the man and the woman, and procreation. So you can see that sexualityism is the polar opposite of familism, about thinking about sex as linking the adults who would be spouses and parents, and the links between adults and their children. I won't go on for purposes of time, but you can also clearly see sexualityism in the approach to AIDS overseas. The best expression of this link was written in a book by another Harvard economist, kind of interesting, Ed Green, in his book, Broken Promises. Now, the U.S. has clearly expressed this, both in its domestic and foreign policies, and I think it is also present, particularly in Europe and Latin America. Let me tell the story of how it has happened in my own country, which I think parallels the story in other countries as well. It begins, of course, with the notion that we have to have contraception as a right, and maybe even state-funded, for married persons. And the rationale is, and this was also the rationale of the dissenting opinion to Humani Vitae, that if you take the baby out of sex, you will strengthen the bond between the husband and wife, that their love will flourish in the absence of children. Immediately following on the law making contraception a right, or even state-funded for marrieds, comes making it a right, and even state-funded, for single persons. Gone is the rationale that it strengthens the bond between the couple now, and rather comes the idea that you even have to take the baby out of sex in order for human sexuality to be free. In the United States in 1972, in a famous opinion called Eisenstadt versus Baird from our highest court, the court said that that human sexuality, even in marriage, is about individual people with separate, it uses the language, separate minds and hearts, having separate thinking and approaches to the question of procreation. And so now you have a constitutional right in our country regarding sex that is now about satisfying individual preferences with regard to procreation. In both of these opinions, contraception for the married and the single, sexualityism is still sub rosa. There is no statement that a person has a right to particular kinds of sexual expression. But it must be understood, axiomatically, that gaining a right to access contraception because it changes the short and long-term meaning and consequences of sex is gaining a right to shape the meaning and consequences of sex, to change them from what they are naturally. Following the contraception cases came in the United States and also in other countries, abortion. First, the supporters of legal abortion and the courts endorsed the notion that this was really about allowing a woman's body and her life to be under her own control. They reasoned further that pregnancy and childbearing causes suffering, including social limitations a woman would want to avoid. Therefore, she must have a legal right to avoid them. At first, there was merely a logical implication that this meant a right to have sexual intercourse free of children and free of any bond. But later, however, our highest court made it explicit that what they were really endorsing was a right to shape your identity, to express yourself sexually and thereby shape your identity. And our court said in 1992, in the most famous expression of this, that, quote, matters associated with sex and procreation involve the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime, choices central to autonomy. At the heart of this liberty, that is the right to have an abortion, is really the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the shape of human life. So in other words, there is no reality out there about what sex is. That it creates a bond, that it gives birth to new life. It is strictly that you do something sexual and thereby create your identity in the universe. And they said it explicitly. This has now been used in all of the cases that have affirmed in the United States a right to same-sex marriage, and of course is now being used, first it was used in the United States as a right, a constitutional right to homosexual sodomy in our federal constitution, and then in the cases for same-sex marriage. You may believe, and many do believe, that our same-sex marriage legal opinions are about either, as the LGBT lobby would have it, getting children a right who are in these same-sex households, to have parents who have access to legal rights and social equality. But really, if you look at the language of the cases, they refer to decisions about who to marry as a way that gay and lesbian people shape their identity. And that the state giving them a right to marriage is the state giving them a right to access the range of human experience that the state's grant of marriage license gives them. It's all about the individual. Even this right to marriage in our legal language is not about a right for a couple, let alone about children. It's about the individual. In the interest of time, I'll mention here only that one sees sexuality as a more and more in U.S. statements regarding foreign policy, whether it is about AIDS or population or the rights of women. And our State Department in particular is making lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender sexual identity what they call a priority for the coming year. I've been asked by the State Department to brief 20 foreign journalists in the coming weeks about the role of LGBT law in the United States because it has become such a priority matter for the State Department. Now I want to talk briefly about where sexualityism comes from. This is no surprise to any of you, and I will keep this very brief, and then talk about its clash with religious freedom. Obviously, a first source for sexualityism is feminism, which ties women's equality to being equal to men, and this perception that men have sex without bonds and without children. There's so much more to say there, but I want to keep this brief. Another source, of course, is the sexual revolution itself, which overlaps with feminism, obviously, but really just extended to women the power perceived to be already held by men, which was one of having sex without its natural consequences, the formation of a bond or the procreation of children. Another possible source for sexualityism is, of course, secularism. This is difficult to discuss briefly, but one might say that this is a rejecting of the idea that religion has anything to offer the world for understanding who the human person is, particularly as compared with the hard empirical sciences. And of course, included in this general rejection of religion is rejection of any religious wisdom about sex, which includes the natural law about sex. A fourth possible source for sexualityism is, of course, technology shock, the pill. The area of law and economics, which is the area in which my university specializes, is very clear on the fact that when you altered the relation between sex and procreation, right, you also altered the entire meaning of human sexuality, particularly for women, in which this bond between sex and procreation was so evident. You create a market for sex and marriage in which women are disadvantaged, right? Because they are now in a marketplace where for every woman who will have sex without marriage, the price of sex goes down. More and more women feel inclined and forced to have sex without commitment. And so instead of the pill resulting in fewer unintended pregnancies, non-marital births, and abortion, we now, of course, have more of all of it, because the price of sex has gone way down because of easy access to the pill and abortion. This is verified in really almost every law and economics article on the subject. You don't see a pushback on this consequence. The leading Nobel Prize-winning scientist on this, George Akerlof, University of California, has not really been refuted. I just want to note an irony in this area, of course, which is that the pill and abortion, which were promoted as women's rights movements, have really resulted in the immiseration of women in this sex and mating market, right? They have sex when they don't wish to, they have depression which follows it, they have unintended pregnancies, out-of-wedlock births, the poverty associated with both of them, abortions, post-abortion syndrome, they marry less often, they divorce more often. For any of you who would like to find out more about the law and economics literature on this, it is flourishing in the United States, and I'd be happy to provide you with that. I want to talk finally now about sexualityism and the clash with religion for just a few moments. My point here is that proponents of sexualityism, not surprisingly, right, see religion as their primary enemy. And all the laws to promote access to contraception and abortion and now same-sex marriage come with a disavowal that there could possibly be any religious exemptions to this. They say there could no more be religious exemptions to these laws than there could be in civil rights laws demanding equality of treatment with regard to race or national origin. And then when we ask for exemptions, we are basically asking for the right to do a wrong. That is the position they've put us in. Begging for exemptions puts us in the position of asking for a right to violate equality, to violate women's rights, to violate non-discrimination. It's a terrible legal position. It's a terrible linguistic situation to be in, and it is true in every country where sexualityism laws are promoted. Of course, you realize that this squashing of religious freedom will only result in the greater immiseration, making miserable of the very groups in whose name this progress is allegedly proposed. Women, children, the poor, new immigrant groups who are already suffering the loss of marriage and no marriage at all, more divorce, more cohabitation, are the very people who will lose if religious actors exit the square and take with them their thick notions of long-term, exclusive, permanent, faithful, fruitful marriage. Religion takes the body seriously, welcomes children, and promotes women's good in marriage in particular. So, final conclusion, 2 points here. First, I think we have to make it apparent to people that sexualityism has replaced familism. And we have to describe how, from the perspective of human nature, our physical bodies, our psychological well-being, and our social good, this is a terrible disaster. Most women and the dispossessed, the poor and others who are not achieving marriage and stable marriage. Finally, in the current struggles between sexualityism and religious freedom, I don't think it's enough to just continue to ask for exemptions for religion. It is as if we are asking for religion to be allowed to continue to discriminate. We have to make it clear that the religious position is the position on the side of freedom, on the side of women, on the side of the natural ecology of the human body, on the side of the relationship between the natural family and a good economy, and that we are not asking for some narrow permission to discriminate, but for the right to continue to champion women and the natural good of the family and of the economy in the public square.